Hey everyone, welcome to the Student Ministry Conversations podcast with your hosts, Russell Martin and Brent Aiken. We are glad you're joining us today, and we hope you find this conversation helpful, insightful, and encouraging as you lead your students in ministry. We want to remind you about our social media. You can find us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Talk Student Men. And today we are going to sit down and hear a conversation that Russell had with Kate Boyd. Now, Kate is a writer, a speaker, and is also a Bible teacher, and she joins the conversation to talk about doing ministry differently. Russell, this was your conversation, so can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yes, Kate shares how a foreign mission trip she went on for several years and where she saw how other cultures and people live out their faith and the role that the church played. She talks about how that caused her not to question her faith, but to look at her own experiences and to evaluate that. We talked about the meaning of Christian community, the role of doubt in faith development, and why it's important to create space for students to ask questions and to explore those answers together. So it was a great conversation. We covered a lot of things. It kind of jumps around a little bit, but I know you'll enjoy it. I'm looking forward to you hearing that.
Man, that sounds awesome. So without further ado, here is Russell's conversation with Kate Boyd.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Student Ministry Conversations podcast. I am Russell Martin, and I'm glad you're joining us today. And so today we have with us Kate Boyd. Kate, instead of me telling them about you, why don't you tell us about you, as big or as little, as much or as little as you want? Who are you? How'd you get to where you are now? And what are you doing?
Yeah. So by day, I do communications work at a university in some of their donor events department. And then later in the day, I go to seminary. And then, later in the day from that, I hang out online and, hope to encourage and equip, and help people think about Christianity and culture and, a faith that stands wherever you are. And so whether that's in location or life. And so, I sort of got here from when I was really young. I grew up as sort of like a mutt. We sort of hopped around from different denominations, but close to middle school, we landed in the Southern Baptist circles, and that's where we stayed for through my college years. I graduated college, and I actually went to seminary at Dallas Seminary for about a year and a half. We were way too broke because my husband and I got married at that point, couldn't afford it. So I dropped out. And we sort of have hung out in Bible churches and stuff like that for the last 10, 12 years. In the last couple of years, we've made a couple of shifts. Some of that was facilitated by, I do communications and marketing work. And so part of that was I had a job at a missions agency, and part of my job was to go around the world and capture stories of what was happening in the different places in which they worked. And that sort of like really opened my eyes and made me realize that a lot of what I thought was essential was actually cultural. And so I've just spent the last decade unpacking some of that for myself. And then, we are now joining a United Methodist Church and, hanging out there. And so, we just sort of, I hang out online, like I said, and I like to help people see things differently.
Yeah. And like I said, I came to know Kate basically through Twitter, and kind of came in through some of the things I was following and continue to follow, and kind of connected with you doing seminary and being where you're doing seminary at, and Hebrew class, I think, was one of because I know that's was a huge challenge for me. So prayers for you as you continue to.
Oh, thank you. It is the most foreign language I've ever seen in my life. It's tough, but it's also it's fun. I love languages, so it's fun, but it is challenging.
Well, if you have any questions on it, ask me and I can find somebody to help you, because I will probably not be the person to ask you. So I'm curious, I want to go back before we get in. We're going to talk today, you've talked about a discipleship pyramid and kind of a framework to look at with ministry. But you I'm assuming that a lot of this started developing, like you said, with that trip, the missions trips and doing those. So what are some of the things that caused you to kind of think, or what are some of those questions you asked, and how did you kind of cycle through those and decipher those things as you were going on your trip?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people can relate to this, right? If you've ever done a mission trip, or if you've ever, maybe it's even like summer camp for you, right? You went to Bible camp and you came back and you're sort of like processing the experience, and maybe you're processing some of the things you saw or heard or learned. And that was me, except I was not in my own culture. I was over there, and really it sounds super glamorous to get to travel, but it was really like I sat in on the floor in someone's home, or in like this little church, which, was built of straw that hung out on a mountainside, and I sat there for hours and hours and hours a day, just like basically trying to transcribe what I was hearing. And you really just like get the sense. The first thing for me is how, like, I considered myself a really serious Christian. I knew a lot of things. I did a lot of things. We, followed all the stuff, but I could tell that these people had a faith that it felt more sincere than mine. And I think part of that was this sort of like necessity. It, like, for them, it was good news. So like in the places that this agency worked, it was in places where there were high populations of unreached people, or there was like restricted access. So some of these people had never heard of Jesus before they heard about him this time. And so to see people react to Jesus when they had very little exposure to, what we believe about Jesus, like the way it actually changes how they look at their lives and how they process their lives was really convicting to me, because I like Jesus and church was the water I swam in. Right. And so it was really hard for me to see that. And so I think that was one of the big things, and to really grasp like what persecution is. I mean, at least one person, one partner on the ground, not anyone that I met, but at least one person had been martyred, like that was associated with the organization. So like these are like real challenges. Several people I met had been disowned by family or cut off in the community from like people just like stopped buying whatever it is they were selling or making or doing because they sort of went against the religious grain of the community. And so there were like real consequences. And so when these people made the decision to follow Jesus, they had to actually weigh the cost of following Jesus in a way that I had never really had to do, outside of like the movies we watched. I went to a private Christian school, so they made us watch some like terrifying end times movies when we were way too young to be watching them. Thinking about like, what will you do if you're faced with that choice, And so like in my head, persecution was pretty theoretical, but for them it's every day. And so that was a big change. I would say the other big thing that really struck me was like community and the need, and how it like should be real and safe, and how in each other's lives people were. I think part of that was cultural. They're much more communal cultures, the places that I happened to go. But in the same way, it was, these are the people that they banded together and they took care of one another, and they, met at each other's homes to pray and to worship. And, they brought each other lunches and dinners, and they gave each other money when they needed it. And so it's just sort of like, it was not the kind of community that I felt I had experienced. And so that really shook me. Like I got home and I tried to sort of like make that happen. And like nobody else was up for it. Like nobody else was in. They didn't want it. And so for me, it's sort of been a journey of figuring out how to like, and I would say there's probably some some theological shifts along the way, but those are like the ones that really hung around and like pushed me, even in the direction that I am now. And so since then, it's been sort of finding the balance between, holding up this ideal and like theoretical and probably not entirely practical view of what like community and church and all these things are, but also finding a way to bridge that gap at least a little, because I do, whether that's like, in our faith and in our practice, but then also in our time together, because I've seen how impactful it is and I've seen how powerful it is, not just for the people involved, but how that like spirals out to their communities and their, and even their country in a way that I don't think we see here. And I think that bringing it down and grounding it in that kind of experience and environment would actually be hugely beneficial for the American church too.
I mean, is that something you see? Like, how would you make that? You talk about being a bridge. How would you start to bridge that and make that where we could see in our church over here in the United States, how we could see the benefit of that, or do you see examples of that already? Or how would you make it practical for us?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have kernels of it. But I think a lot of churches, at least, I grew up evangelical. And so for us, in my experience, there were a couple of things that were emphasized. One is it's very like, what do you know and how much do you know? So it was very like knowledge-based. I am very grateful for my evangelical experience because I do know a lot. I came to the table with a lot. And that's why I sort of joke when I went to seminary that like I studied biblical languages and, church history, because those are the gaps in my evangelical education. I learned theology. I learned, some biblical studies and things like that. And so for me, I think what we needed to do, the first thing I would say is part of that, like, not just keeping it in our heads, but like learning, practicing it in a way and working on like, not just focusing on what we know, but what we do and marrying those. Right. And I think on the on that same wavelength, I think the first step of that is like moving it from sort of a consumer kind of experience, to, a more discipleship based experience. And so looking at that and I think part of that is by bringing people in and equipping them and making them part of taking ownership of the discipleship of other people in the church. And I think we see kernels of that, right, with like small groups and things like that. But I don't know that they're always mobilized and equipped and utilized in a way in which they can actually be the presence of the church and perform a lot of the functions of a church, depending on how your theology works around the church, and really live that out every day without overburdening a pastor at the top, right, who cannot possibly meet every person unless there's only a handful of people in your church to perform all that pastoral care. Like, what if everybody was a semi-pastor, right? What if everyone was responsible? And what if everybody saw themselves as confident and capable to shape one another with their unique gifts? And so I think we have kernels of it, but we haven't quite, there are probably ones out there that have, but I think we could really more effectively utilize, like, there are so many talented and wonderful people across churches nationwide, young, old, whatever. And I think being able to let them loose and do their thing and provide the accountability and resources to do that, we could actually just like think how much deeper community and discipleship could go, and how we then sort of like flip the model upside down.
I'm just going to listen to you talk because that's no. Well, it makes sense. So, I mean, I now find myself in a senior pastor role. I got demoted from youth director to senior pastor. I kid, but that's something we're talking about. We're going Bob Goff does book right now as a study. But I've told everybody, I said I want us to be sending out. I want each of you to be a missionary in your mission field, whether that is your work, whether that is the restaurant you go to all the time, the gym you work out in, the people you hang out with on the weekend and watch football with, the people you play golf with, whatever that is. I think we should be equipping you to do the ministry. Because I've told them from the beginning, I said, I'm one person.
Yeah.
So if I do all the pastoral care and hospital visits and all the stuff like that, I'll be doing that for about a year and a half, and then I'll be burned out and not be helpful to anyone.
Right.
But I've always seen that goal is to equip and encourage and empower others for ministry, and that my role should be leading and guiding and equipping them and figuring out the ways to do that. How do we help students and youth leaders? Because there's some people already set in their ways. There's some people they've done church the way they've done it. People like me, we're older and we've done it our way, and people are resistant to change. But we have students, we have 6th graders, 7th graders, 8th graders, we have youth directors who I hate the phrase are the future of the church, because they're not, they're the church now. But they are building the church for the next several years, and the things that they do will be what becomes normal in churches, hopefully. So how can youth leaders and those who are working with youth and youth themselves kind of do some things with this community? What are some things you would tell a youth leader or a student leader to do?
Yeah. So, I think this is where we can kind of get into the framework that I call the Discipleship Pyramid, because I think it sort of covers those bases. And so the base of the pyramid for me is belonging. I think we all sort of like start with believing and like all this other stuff, but I think you actually have to like start with the environment that you create. Because if you want to actually shape people, or if you want to actually be an influence or be able to actually care for people, there has to be safety so that vulnerability and authenticity can come up, right? And if you don't have that environment for, safety, and you're not even building an environment where people have tools maybe to like connect and work with each other. So I think that's the other part, is how do you not just create the safety, but I think on the other side, how do you give people tools to communicate and work through maybe like interpersonal conflict? So I think there'll be sort of like doubt and other things that we'll talk about in different parts of the framework. But I think this is really about the base level of like, how do we establish a connection in the community that fuels safety? And so I think, knowing some things like being trauma informed and like setting up expectations and ground rules, and even having like the youth do that. I think when I used to lead a youth small group, and they loved that they got a say in how the group would run, because they then felt a little bit more in on whatever it was that we set up. I had a few suggestions, but I was like, how do you guys want to respond, right, to each other? How do you want to treat each other? How do we want to talk about things? So that they sort of created that. And then anytime that I had to correct them on it or call them on one of those things, I'm like, remember, you agreed, you said, right? And so I think establishing that, and some of it is going to take a while, right? People need to know each other socially and sort of in these settings. And so I think also just like creating opportunities for people to gather around their interests, get to know each other, hang out over meals or at the bowling alley or whatever it is kids do these days. I don't have kids, so I have no idea. But like whatever the thing is, create opportunities for them to engage with each other around their interests too. The best relationship in my husband's and our social lives came because we met with this other couple and we're a trivia team every week. And it sort of happened. And now we have a Bible study there at the bar before trivia that has grown into a few other people, because we put it around something that we're interested in. And that's grown into a really great friendship. And, we share things with each other that are hard in other places. And so I think creating that environment of safety so people know that they are respected and taken seriously, people know that they can share something and it be, confidential, within reason and reporting laws and all that good legal, all those legal disclaimers. And then, that they feel like there is a connection with the people in the room so that it sort of facilitates some of that. So I think that's kind of step one, is how do you create the environment in order to get the results that you want? Because it's not just like implementing a framework. It's about, it does no good if the culture is bad.
you talked about, this would be a great time to go in the framework. So tell us about the discipleship pyramid, how you implement that, but starting with what it entails, and I'll just let you go.
Yeah. So belonging is the first one, which we covered. I think the next we sort of have, and these three go together, but I do think they build on each other. The first is believe. So this is more of your like orthodoxy, right? So you're looking at who you are, who God is. What is it that we as Christians believe, and how is that different? Um, and and all of that. Like, it's really sort of engaging. This is more of like the head ascent, and engaging some of the things that are traditional and built upon. The second, or I guess it's technically the third thing, is behaving. And so I know this sounds like behavior modification or like strict legalism, and I think that's not what I meant. I just really like alliteration, so I chose the word behave. And this is more like, how do we practice our identity? How do you help people practice our identity? How do you help them practice their righteousness? What tools do you give them to continue to work through things? What are some of the spiritual disciplines they can utilize to like build up their inner selves and strength and connect with each other, and then connect with the world and be Christians in the world? And I say practice, not just in the like, these are the rituals that we do, but how do you actually set them up for success to practice that in the world, in life? You know, what are ways you can take the things that you're teaching them and give them opportunities to like play with each other through those things and work it out? Or what homework can you give them to make them do it in the world? And then the last thing is becoming. And this is sort of where the practice just becomes normalized, right? You sort of become the person who does those things. And this looks like the fruit of the Spirit, right? That's sort of like the measure of what it looks like. And it's sort of like, you don't really need to practice anymore, because you just do the things. You just sort of are there, and you have all the tools, and you're sort of becoming, right, the disciple that you're meant to be. And you sort of go up and down through the phases, or you should be using all of these all the time. It's sort of like the framework I use whenever I'm putting together lessons or something. What do I want them to believe? Who do I want them to be? And then what do we want them to do because of it? And so they all really lean on each other. So maybe a pyramid isn't the best shape for it, but I think it's really important to incorporate all of these into how we shape each other. And I think this goes for adults too. I mean, I think a lot of my life was spent just learning things. And then it turned out that learning stuff really just made me self-righteous and angry at a lot of people. And maybe that's not how it works for everyone, but that's how it worked for me. And so then learning that I actually needed to like practice and do, and love people, especially even when, our points of view collided. And then to see people who did that, and how that then shaped who they became, and who they became then shaped what they did and what they learned and what they knew. It all goes together. And I think that's what makes a whole person, is orthodoxy, orthopraxy, and orthopathy. It's these three things. And it starts with belonging, but you build up through all of these things in order to create, good humans who love Jesus and who practice the way of Jesus wherever they are.
I'm going to have you go back for just a minute. Okay. And define, for those who are listening who have not taken seminary classes or been in the church for a while, and you use a lot of ortho words.
Yes.
So so kind of explain those real quick so we can all be caught up.
So in short, they're basically what I said before: believing, behaving, becoming, right? So orthodoxy is what we believe. It's sort of like right belief, same belief. This is how we believe. Orthopraxy, this is how we practice and behave, and work out things. These are, I think sometimes it's used for like sacraments and how we practice stuff, but I think we can extend it beyond that as well. And then orthopathy. So think like right becoming, right. It's been used before. Like, I believe the first place I've seen it was by John Wesley. He used it, but he would sort of think of it as like right experience, or right feeling. Right. And I think that's a little limiting. But I think this is more like the right becoming of a human being, right? How do we become emotionally mature or mature disciples, mature human beings, in a way that allows us to, embody the fruit of the Spirit? So you put all these together, and I think they create a healthy version of a disciple, more of a holistic approach.
And that idea is very Wesleyan, with going on to perfection and such, with that. So how do you use this framework, which I know there's several different frameworks. People have different words for it, different things. But so you talked about, you keep this in mind whenever you're creating like a lesson or you're creating an activity or something like that. So do you have an example that if someone listening could go, oh, now I see what you're talking about? If you're doing a small group lesson, or you may not have a specific example right off the bat. I didn't ask you for that before, but do you have any way that you could help somebody kind of work through, or even some things to think about when you're putting together a lesson?
I think, if you're starting somewhere, it helps to, start with the scripture, right? Or if you're trying to make a particular point. So for example, if I'm writing a chapter of a book, one of the chapters in my book proposal is about, the whole gospel, right? Which is not just the gospel, but it's also like it's righteousness and justice together, right? And so the right belief is that righteousness and justice go together, that like trusting in Jesus, we're saved, from something and we're saved for something. So, there's scripture, right, that you build out in order to help people understand how that fits in with the narrative of scripture, or how scripture communicates that. And it sort of establishes the belief that they need. And then what do we do because of that? What does it actually look like to do that? And this is maybe where people would say application, right? But I think it needs to be like concrete and specific, but also like have people engage and figure out what it is that they actually, what would that look like in their lives? So I think we give examples, but sometimes people sort of get stuck on examples. And so you want them to think creatively and create that for themselves too. So what does it look like then? Or do you have a story of someone who puts these things together really well? So that people can be inspired by that, but understand how it looks, right, to be a person who believes in righteousness and justice going together. So for us, that is a commitment to the gospel, and that is sort of like living in freedom, but it is also taking care of, the poor and the marginalized and all of those things that we believe we should be doing in the world. And then, who do we become? It's sort of a twofold, right? So who do we need to be who is a person who does those things? Ultimately, that looks like Jesus, right? But we're not there. So, what are some of the traits that we need to develop, or what are maybe some of the sins that are inner to us that are holding us back from practicing well what we know, what we believe? And then, how does also doing that thing shape us into a person, right? Like shape us as a person. And so what does it then look like, and how do we look, not just what we do, but how do we actually look and feel on the other side of that? So when you think about all of that, really trying to hit that, or even engaging them and figuring some of that out, is helpful.
Well, you made me think when you talked about when we get stuck on one or the other, that creates either, one's knowledge without action or action without belief, then it creates kind of these imbalances. And I've asked this question to some of the others who have been on here, like Marco Strecker, Walt Mueller, Brock Morgan, some of these guys who've been in youth ministry, who are at the beginning of what we call youth ministry. And they've acknowledged, several of them have acknowledged, there's some things we got right and there's things we got wrong. And when you go through and you look at Fuller Youth Institute with Kara Powell and their research they did, and Kenda Creasy Dean and the Almost Christian book, and all this stuff has been kind of showing us and revealing for a long time, there's some things we didn't get right. There's some things we focused on that didn't produce the results we hoped. Now, I don't want to knock a lot of that because I'm a product of that youth ministry. I mean,
sure,
I'm a product of, and I came to faith through that. But I also understand that there are some things that have been missed, or have been misfocused, or emphasized throughout the time. So what do you see? Where is it that the church is missing? Because I want to get the perspective of you're a little younger than I am. You're a lot younger than I am. You've been through youth a lot more recently than I have. And so you may be able to help, whereas somebody who is a veteran who's been doing this for 30 years versus someone who's coming from this other side. Where is the church getting it wrong? Why are we losing? What's your thought on why are there students walking away from faith? Why are there, all this going on? Where is it we are missing? And you can share it as much as you want, or you can go wherever you want to go to with that.
So I think one of the main things, at least that affected me, and that I hear from a lot of people is, and this may come from a background again that was very knowledge based versus experience and expected you to do more than keep a moral code. I think first of all, it's been really weird the last few years to see people who raised me in the faith. So like I said, I went to a Christian school. I grew up in, in the waters of, Southern Baptist Church anyway. And the way it sort of felt like all these people who taught me and admonished me to take my faith seriously kind of got mad then when I did, and it went a different direction than they expected. Or sometimes we noticed an incongruency in how they live versus what they taught us. And so, I think a lot of people think people are walking away from the church because they're not taking it seriously. And I think for some of us, it's because we do take it so seriously. And so I think there's some of that has been happening. I think another thing is, we sort of settled for, we thought we needed simplicity when the world is much more complex than that. I was taught apologetics and how to defend my faith and all of these things, but I wasn't really taught about how to process grief, or how to process anger, or what happens when I'm depressed or anxious, besides quoting the Bible verse about don't be anxious about anything. You know what I mean? We tried to give really simple answers and they sound really nice, but we are humans having a human experience, with a spiritual component. And I think sometimes we miss that part too. And I think we tried a lot of behavior modification instead of trying to, a simple legal moral code, instead of expecting us to be whole human disciples. I think we gave more knowledge than we gave tools and filters and ways of thinking, so that when we come up with the problem, we're not just well, that's not what I was taught. So then we either lose faith completely, or we throw other people out throughout the new information we have because we don't know what to do with it. That's a bunch of things. So I'll probably stop there.
You're good. You're good. Well, because what I'm thinking in my head is, if you're talking to youth leaders now, mm-hmm. some of them who are just coming into this, like I said in the before we started recording, I was there's some who raised their hand to volunteer for something else and turned out being the youth leader, or they had their kid was in the program and there was nobody else to do the youth program, and so they said, "I'll do it." But I could just imagine they're coming into this with limited resources and knowledge, and they're being hit with words like deconstruction and walking away from faith and questions and things that they are not equipped to do with. So what I'm trying to think is how can we help youth leaders is there any ways that we can help youth leaders now? What would you say to youth leaders now as they are having students coming with questions who can fact check anything we say? Because that did not exist whenever I was in youth.
In your pocket, right?
Yeah, they can sit there and anything I say in a sermon, they're wait, no, that wasn't the year that happened or whatever. And they can fact check anything. So go ahead.
Yeah, I think the first thing is, one, don't be afraid of saying I don't know. I think we put a lot of pressure on ourselves to know the answer. or to know the answer right now and to like be pros at everything all the time. But either saying, I don't know, let me look and get back to you, or I don't know, let's look at it together. Right. And I think that's something that we could really do better. So I would almost say maybe it's less of a let me teach you this and more of a let's have a discussion about this together. And hey, do you have a scripture we could look up for that? Or here's one that I think of. What do we think the Bible says? Or even, like look at Wikipedia, look at Google, start there. Those are great. I Google stuff all the time just to have a starting point, right? I'm like, oh, I know a couple of verses about this or that, but let me Google and see what comes up. And I usually get some really good consolidated things to jump off of. And so I think moving maybe more to something that's more of like a communal discussion, right? Where you're working through and then people sort of see how you process or how you're leading people to process. And then you're not just giving them answers, you're giving them a safe community to have doubts and questions. And you're giving them tools to process information and to look things up. And you're giving them opportunities to connect with each other and, to build trust with one another. And they get to exercise some of those confidence and creativity muscles that I think every believer needs. And so I think that's probably, if I was walking in on day one, that's probably something I would consider trying to do more of.
So you talked about doubt. What is the role of doubt in discipleship in students as they're going? I know there's a point where you have your faith that you were taught and all the stories you were taught. I liken it to the fact that I was taught that George Washington chopped down the cherry tree. That I learned in high school or in elementary school, and then when you get to college, you realize it's a little more complex than that. Right. But you have to kind of go through that process. So churches are afraid of doubt. Leaders are afraid of doubt. I know this being as a pastor and being in youth ministry. But what is the role and importance of doubt, and should we embrace that, or what would you say to the importance and role that doubt plays in youth and adults too?
Yeah, I think for sure. I think doubt is part of being a disciple, right? If you look at the Gospels, the old familiar phrase, "Oh, ye of little faith," right? Like it's there for a reason. Jesus says it a lot, like the disciples who lived and walked and laughed and slept next to him and ate meals with him constantly also doubted. They didn't get it. And so I think first putting the pressure on us to always be faithful is not realistic. And it's not helpful, because then when people do have doubts, they sort of hide or don't feel safe to come. And I think that in that isolation is where doubt becomes destructive instead of constructive. And I think doubt can also, if we're open to exploring it, if we're open to wrestling with it, can actually drive us deeper, right, in relationship with God and relationship with one another. And so I think I don't want to say that fears about doubt are unwarranted. I think they do happen, but and they can be hard and they can be destructive. And some people who doubt and go a different direction will try to tear stuff down. Like that's just humanity, right? But one of my favorite stories is Jesus and Thomas, which I just like. I'm kind of obsessed with it ever since I learned like what happened to Thomas after, or at least what tradition says Thomas did after. Thomas isn't in the room when everybody else sees the resurrected Jesus. He's out somewhere, who knows? And then he comes back and they're like, well, you just missed him. He's like, well, I'll believe it when I see it, basically. And Jesus wasn't like, well, I'm never going to show up again because I know what Thomas said. Like he doesn't get mad about it. Or how dare he doubt that I resurrected? How dare he doesn't believe all these people? Instead, he comes back. He walks up to Thomas and he's like, here, look, examine it for yourself. See, the wounds in my hand, my side, like, look at it. You can see all of it. And I just see him being so tender and so willing for Thomas to examine that. And, Thomas is like, I believe, because it's here. And it's like, thank you for doing that. And, Thomas took the gospel to, India by tradition. And so like he ran with it after that. But I think in a lot of ways, if we're willing to let doubt be a platform for discovery, we can actually find that on the other side, wherever our doubt leads us, we're going to be stronger in that conviction because we explored it and we did the work around it, than if we just sort of like, well, I'll just have to accept that maybe it's not it, or you sort of just walk away. All the things that I've had to re-examine over the years, the things that I feel that I've done a lot of work around, I feel much more confident about. And I feel like I have less need to like hit people over the head with those beliefs now than I used to. People don't have to believe everything that I believe or all the exact same convictions, whether that's women or baptism or whatever. Like, cool. I don't need you to do that. I am free of the need of convincing other people, but I am more sure in my convictions now than I have ever been. And it was doubt and wrestling that brought me there. And so it can actually be a tool for building spiritual confidence in people, if we're willing to engage it. And so creating space for people to engage that and ask hard questions and actually learn to wrestle with them is really, I think it can be a really important and integral part of building a faith life.
I think a lot of times we like I said, we get scared of when we hear doubt. We get, and now we have this new word that's come out in the past couple of years, deconstruction.
Yeah.
I don't want to go long-term into this, but can you give us a little bit of one of the things you mentioned when I asked you about things, and this may go along with doubt. I don't know if it does, and that's what I want to find out. Is you said how deconstruction is healthy and even imperative for discipleship. So if you have just like a few minutes, could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I think the first thing is sort of removing the stigma of deconstruction, because I think there are a lot of people out there who want you to believe it's a specific thing. First, yes, it did, right, arise from postmodern literary or philosophical constructs, but that's not how a lot of people are using it these days. At least not in this sort of like mainstream Christian space. So it's not like there to tear everything apart. I think a lot of people are just using it for the process of figuring out what they actually believe, when they have just sort of like grown up with a set of beliefs. And like a lot of us, right, we've either experienced doubt or we're figuring out, what we believe that's maybe different because we see where that has led with the people who raised us in the faith. And so we're trying to figure it out. We're trying to see if that's still true for us, or if it's just like, or if we need to shift, or if that's still true and they had shifted. Like we're figuring out, we're sifting through. So I think it's just a process of examining your beliefs carefully. And, Paul says that's fine. Be a Berean, right? Examine everything he says by scripture. And I even think this is actually like a really grand Christian tradition. Like, again, if you go back to the Gospels, Jesus, like everyone thought religion was one thing. The religion of the God of Israel was one thing. And Jesus is like, you've seen it, you've had it written, right? You've seen that, but I tell you it's this. And so he's there tearing down their constructs left and right. And he's reorienting their entire idea of eternity and the kingdom of God and all of this stuff that has like really profound implications. And so it forced people to examine or to check out things, to go back to scripture and look at what was written in the Hebrew Bible and see how it held up, and people believed. And so I think it starts with Jesus. But even if we look at like the Protestant Reformation, like what were they doing there? They saw some things in the church that they didn't like, that they were convinced wasn't quite right. And so they went and examined scripture and they examined the processes of the church. And they said, how do we then go forward with a better, more faithful version, or what we believe to be a more faithful version of what we had? And it caused a lot of division and clearly a lot of uproar, and a lot of things were said and done, but it's part of, now the tradition that I'm a part of, and pretty much everybody I know is a part of, I don't know very many Catholics or Eastern Orthodox people personally. But like now we have all of this. And so I think it's sort of putting it in historical perspective and saying, and even theological perspective, and saying like, God, the church, Christianity is not going to go away because a few people decided to look very carefully at faith. If you're worried about that, then I think maybe you need to examine some things about what you believe about God, the church, and faith, right? Like if you don't think it can stand up to some of those questions. And, two, putting it in that historical perspective and going, people have been doing this for as long as Christianity has existed. It has been around. And most of the people who go through it, there are some exceptions, right? There are people who deconvert, but most of the people who go through it are really just trying to figure out what is biblical and what is cultural and like what is true and what has sort of been added on and what's important and what's not important. And they're just sort of sifting that out and sorting it and categorizing it so that they end up with something that is solid, that they feel like they can stand on. So like, I like to use the word disentangling more than deconstruction, because I think that's what the process looked like for me. I was still sure about Jesus. It was just all these other little things that had sort of like come in and gotten tangled up with what I thought was really important. So that's what deconstruction is doing for a lot of people. And so I think it's really important to have that perspective, historically and theologically, and even creating that space, right? So that sort of feeds into like the doubt and the examination and the discussion that allows us to rebuild. Because once you sort of strip that stuff away, you're prepared now to rebuild, to reconstruct in the way of Jesus. And so if you do that, those convictions will be stronger because you've worked through it. So I think it's actually healthy. And I think it's something we should always be doing to an extent. Once you've decided something, that's great, stay there. But we're always sinful people, right? So we will always be sort of viewing things through a lens that may not be 100% correct. And so we have to keep checking ourselves to refine ourselves and our belief too.
And, when I look back on my journey, I can see points where if that had been a label at that time, which it wasn't a label at that time, then that's exactly what I went through.
Yeah.
I grew up in the church. I went to Sunday school. I, sat in, we did the little flannel graph on the, I don't know if you remember flannel graph or not.
I do.
I did a flannel graph, Jesus and Jonah and the whale, and remember all those stories. And I learned, and then we had confirmation. And I even did not go through confirmation with everybody else because I was like, hey, there's still some questions. And so I remember going through that process. It just didn't have the name. And the reason I think it's important to talk about is because there are youth leaders all over the United States and the world who are being hit with this term, deconstruction. And they just have this, knowledge of whatever was on CNN or whatever was on the latest blog or latest TikTok or whatever it is like that.
Right.
And so that's what I wanted to give people was not to talk about whether you should or shouldn't, or the value of that, which I think there is value in there in questioning and coming back with even stronger beliefs. But I wanted for people to understand, hey, if someone's talking about this, then this may be what they're talking about. They may be talking about just rethinking and examining for themselves. And it's not something to shy away from or to go get away from me or push them out, but to embrace and go, hey, well, like you said earlier with doubt, let's find out.
Yeah.
And so don't be scared off by that when a student comes or a parent comes to you, or college student comes back, or their parent says, hey, my kid's talking about this. What is it? I want to encourage you to do some research and
do some research and be curious. Like if your kid said that, ask them, ask them, what do you mean by that? What does that look like for you? What are you thinking about? I think curiosity is like our number one tool in this. And if we do that, and curiosity with a side of humility, right? And then we can, from there, we kind of actually know what we're talking about and what we're dealing with. But I think we're sort of taking a lot of definitions at face value when they actually are very multifaceted.
Yeah. Okay. So on your Twitter and your blog and several things, you talk about messy middle Christians. So you want to give us a little bit about what that is? Just kind of just let us know kind of what that entails.
Sure. I think it's people who are kind of in this deconstructing, disentangling. Maybe they're starting to like rebuild some things. I sort of see myself on the upswing of the rebuilding, right? As a place. So people who are, we're caught between a lot of worlds. I know for me, that looks like, loving the church and wanting to leave the church sometimes. And it looks like somewhere between conservative and progressive theological or political beliefs, or a little bit of both, right? We're sort of at all over the place. We don't fit neatly into boxes. That's because we're either figuring it out or we've done work and just realized we don't fit neatly into the boxes. And I think that's okay. And so it's really like learning what's important. So we're committed to the important things and we're letting ourselves explore all the other stuff. And even as we commit to some of those stances or whatever, we are holding those things with grace and humility and love, because we know what it's like to walk through that, or we know that people are, well, I like to make the generous assumption that people are trying to be faithful, just like I'm trying to be faithful. And that, spoiler alert, the Bible isn't super clear about everything. And so, and so that there are a lot of places that you can go when you read certain things or you put certain things together, that there are a spectrum of belief around, a bunch of issues. And so we can hold all of that while still counting each other as faithful believers together. So it's really just the kind of, and this is the name of my newsletter, the kind of untidy faith that we tend to have and how we sort of navigate the various tensions, and explore and figure things out and, rebuild or reshape a church that, values that sort of exploration and discipleship and building up of each other, and the community, both inside and outside its walls.
Well, I want to say thank you for holding that space.
Yeah.
So what all does that space entail? You talk about a newsletter, you talked about, you did a podcast at one point, like what are all those things?
So the long list. Okay. So one is my monthly newsletter. It's called Untidy Faith. And I just sort of explore different things. It's kind of like a whatever's on my mind that I sort of took a deep dive around, and then I explore that with you. Or I ask a lot of people a lot of times on my social media what they're curious about or what they're thinking about and what's on their mind, and help to unpack some of that for them in various ways. I do also have a podcast, and it has a variety of formats. The season we're currently in, we are going through the book of Acts. And I sit with two of my friends each time, people that I've met around the internet, and we walk through all the stories and just sort of talk about what we learned, what we saw, and find new insights together. So it's really engaging the Bible in community. I have some other seasons that are sort of arranged by topic, and that's kind of how I'll be rolling out the season after Acts. We'll be doing a little bit more of that in order to help me get through seminary without going crazy. And then you can find me on social media. I hang out on Instagram at kateboyd.co, and I hang out on Twitter at bkateboyd.
Awesome. That's what I was going to ask, is all the places we can find you and hang out. I will tell you, I follow you on Twitter. I think I may follow you on Instagram too, but Twitter is where I see a lot of your stuff, and you're just real there. I mean, sometimes it's my seminary classes are overbearing. Can you please pray for me? Or talking about this or that. And so it's always good. So, well, there's more that I wanted to get to that we can't because of time. But Kate, this has been a joy talking to you. And, I'm glad just from a couple of tweets and a couple of emails that we were able to have this conversation. I hope you've had a good time with this.
Yeah,
as well.
No, this was really fun. Thanks so much for having me. It's funny because I find that I've probably been on more youth ministry podcasts than like other kind in like a specific genre. And so I'm really excited that people are like talking about these things. And so thanks for having me and for having this space for, people trying to shape the next generation.
And I hope that we can get to some of those other things in maybe a future episode. But until then, prayers for you in seminary and Hebrew and all of that going forward. And I'm sure we'll be commiserating together on Twitter and things with classes and stuff going on. But thank you for this time and for the space and for your time being with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Hey, thanks everyone for joining us today. We hope that you were encouraged and inspired by this week's episode and that you found tools that you can use as you pour into the lives of your students.
Yes. And as always, if you enjoyed this, if you found it helpful, share this with someone else, tag them and tag us at Talk Student Men, put it on Facebook, put a link on Instagram, put it on Twitter, wherever you can do that. Also, leave us a comment, leave us a rating wherever you're listening. We would appreciate that so much. It helps us to get the word out. Also, just a reminder, go and check out the Talk Student Men merchandise on the website. See how you can continue to support us financially. That helps us to continue to make the podcast even better as we move forward. So Brent, speaking of moving forward, you have next week's episode. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so next week I sit down with a friend of mine named Karis Karstensen. She is a youth pastor up in the panhandle of Texas in a town called Happy. And so we sit down to talk about how to invest in your church and not just the student ministry or the ministry that you're involved in. It's a great conversation, and I can't wait for y'all to hear it.
All right. Well, that is coming up next week. But for this week, we are done. Just a reminder, studentministryconversations.org, show notes, links from this episode, just search for it in the search bar. And there's also other helpful articles and posts there as well. Again, thank you for joining us. And we look forward to our conversation next week.